I would like to thank, of course, Christina and Janice for this amazing conference, to Cynthia for all her help with this session, and to each and every one of you for sticking it out to the last paper. That's fantastic. Whew, I better keep it snappy. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right, Christina. Much, much more. Much, much more. In 1918, Martha Jane Elliott, a board member of the United Farm Women of Manitoba, was put in charge of young people's work. In this capacity, she began organizing quilting bees, where the quilts produced were used in two ways. First, to provide warmth to the children and wives of farmers who spent their days in Manitoba towns when the families came in to buy and sell goods. And second, as fundraisers to create permanent spaces in these same towns so that the women and their children would have a safe place to spend many hours as their husbands went about their business. The types of quilts produced through Elliott's initiatives were not aesthetic masterworks. I have to say the one in my family is really ugly. And the women who worked on designing and sewing the quilts left no trace of their identities. However, aesthetics and name value were secondary to the United Farm Women of Manitoba's quilt project, which placed political change first. These quilts are representative of the fact that Canada's cultural fabric has been knit together in part by the women who have pursued various hobby crafts. These amateur crafts have become important markers of regional, national, and personal identities. This paper will not focus on an individual female maker, but instead will argue that studying craft works by amateurs raises important challenges to traditional art historical approaches such as the monograph. They demand acknowledgement of groups of anonymous practitioners whose works fall outside professional classifications while simultaneously providing popular culture benchmarks that define both craft and national identity ideals. I should confess here that Martha Jane Elliott is my great-grandmother. She not only worked for the United Farm Women of Canada, she became their Manitoba president in 1923. A dedicated suffragette and one of Nellie McClung's key prairie supporters, she left her children and husband on the family's large farm near Cardale, Manitoba, and traveled extensively, lecturing and visiting isolated farm women to encourage them to begin the fight for their rights. Elliott had a flair for attacking the weak spots, especially concerning the plight of farm women. Issues that were of major concern to her included the raising of large families without adequate medical and nursing facilities. Also, women shouldered the responsibility of garden, poultry, and dairy in order to buy food for the family, yet they sold their produce non-cooperatively, and although the woman was her husband's working partner, the laws denied women an equal share in their homesteads. Unwitting husbands lay sleeping under these quilts, while the funds they raised through the United Farm Women of Manitoba went to support some pretty subversive initiatives. Elliott used them to build these comfortable rooms for women I mentioned earlier, to occupy during their long visits to town with their husbands, who often were delayed not only through business, but through long hours spent drinking at pubs like this Grandview in Dauphin, where much of the family's income might also be spent. And of course, some of the money went to support Elliott's suffrage campaigning. Not only is it impossible to trace the makers of these quilts, most of the quilts themselves have disappeared. And this is where traditional art historical methods fail them. In 2011, I traveled to Cardale, Manitoba for my grandmother's funeral. And while I was there, I tried to track down some more details on these quilts. I wanted to fulfill my deep-seated art historical impulses, which included things like locating the material objects, contrasting and comparing their aesthetic traits, and of course, naming the makers. After a luckless pursuit, as so well outlined by others in this conference, it was my great-aunt Esther who changed my thinking when she said, and I have to point out, over the most prairie of United Church lunches, finger sandwiches and a jellied fruit salad, that she said, Sandra, finding the ladies who made these quilts doesn't matter. What matters is that they made them, and these quilts made things change. I realized that my desire to assign authorship to craft objects did not apply to these quilts. In this case, their power lay in the anonymous mass of makers behind them, not the single artist. In our efforts to establish a craft history as a credible parallel field to art history, we have often done these anonymous groups a disservice. As we scramble to identify and reify individual craftspeople, we risk overlooking the craft amateurs who are busy creating our true benchmarks of national identity, and this, I believe, has serious gendered implications. In his seminal book on nationalism, Imagined Communities, Benedict Anderson reminds us that the nation is always, quote, an imagined political community. Imagined as a community because regardless of actual inequality and exploitation that might prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deep, horizontal comradeship. When Martha Jane Elliott was campaigning for suffrage, she was doing this to ensure that Manitoba and Canadian women helped lead the way to the vote. During the First World War, when she organized 3 branches of the Red Cross Society in Manitoba and got the local women to work tirelessly knitting socks, mittens, and scarves to send overseas to the servicemen, she was doing this to support the war effort. In both cases, the quilts and knitted goods could not function as works of individual authored artistry. By necessity, in the case of the quilts, anonymity protected women from their political subversiveness, and in the case of knitting these vast quantities required, speed and adherence to strict patterns were the rules. These women had to remain anonymous and only symbolic of loving female care. And this crafted femininity operated as the imagined political community, a reminder of the, quote, deep horizontal comradeship. This is not to dismiss the fact that many women developed unique aesthetics in their work and did author them. However, military knitting patterns, as only one example, were designed to be compatible with soldiers' and sailors' uniforms, aren't those attractive, and were required to be knitted in olive drab or navy blue. I have to tell you, I was researching this, and my 6-year-old and my 10-year-old both want one of those face things. These limitations were not only due to the requirements of military uniforms during battle, they were indicative of the relationship between aesthetics and nationalism. Their colors, shapes, and patterns epitomize the special qualities of the nation, and by their simple forms and rhythms, seem to conjure a vivid sense of unique history and/or destiny among this designated population. Therefore, it could be argued that the reading of these anonymous crafts created for larger social goals must also be interpreted through this lens of the nation, and that in turn there is no such thing as a truly innocent craft. Chatelaine magazine is an excellent example of the fraught connection between nationalism, craft, and feminine identity. Launched in March 1928 by MacLean Hunter Publishers, Chatelaine has long been regarded as the national voice and champion for Canadian women. As Valerie J. Kornick describes in her excellent book, Roughing It in the Suburbs, reading Chatelaine magazine in the 50s and 60s, the magazine, like Elliott's quilt, was an outlet for Canadian women's rebelliousness. Quote, it could sit on your coffee table and no one would think you had something subversive on it, recalled journalist and contributor June Colwood, because everyone had chatelaine and men thought it was harmless, all about Easter hats. It was far from that. It was like lighting up a brush fire. It was wonderful. In between articles like the 1936 Debunking the Mother Myth were a small scattering of craft articles that provided very contradictory narratives. In December 1950, my favorite was written by Bob Allen, who took a masculine approach, writing a satirical piece titled Homemade Gifts Are Out. In it, he described his inept craft skills, while telling his wife, quote, who is already knitting Uncle Charlie a sweater, recovering 2 lampshades, designing the most cunning little place cards out of walnut shells, and making a couple dozen miniature mantelpieces out of shortbread held together by toothpicks, that, honey, I'm all set to make my own Christmas gifts. He never did, by the way. At the same time, Chatelaine featured a section titled Housekeeping, a Department for Home Management, conducted by women like Helen G. Campbell. And within this section were a few craft patterns, but not many. A dedicated craft editor did not appear in the magazine until Wanda Nels took the position in the 1960s. Despite the appointment of a craft editor, in contrast to American magazines, which often printed sewing and knitting patterns, Chatelaine published a small, usually a quarter-page advertisement for a craft kit or pattern, and readers had to send away for this pattern or kit with a price that ranged between 50 cents and $3. And this, I believe, was in keeping with Chatelaine's emphasis on saving time for women. Beginning in the 1920s, advertisements stressed Heinz's aids to quick feasts, Eagle brand condensed milk, and fast-rising yeast for breads. The new woman distinguished herself through these products, and the time it took to execute traditional craft patterns seemed counterproductive to this cause. Some readers objected to the lack of crafts and expressed a desire for patterns and projects that were distinctly Canadian. In 1962, an anonymous letter from Prince Rupert, British Columbia, argued, quote, "When one tries to buy McCall's Needlework magazine, one is told, that came out last week and we're all sold out." One can only assume the Centennial Sampler sold well, and that hundreds, if not thousands, of Canadian women spent their summer and fall reinforcing nationalistic sentiments stitch by stitch. Their anonymity and the anonymous designer of this sampler served to emphasize the collective nature of this hobby kit. The overt craft nationalism may have been at odds with the non-motifs used in the suffragette quilts made by the United Farmwomen of Manitoba, but it had echoes in the Red Cross knitting that used more abstracted military colors and precise patterns to achieve the tangibility and vividness of its characteristic signs. And it marked a new age in Canada's overt nationalism as it distinguished itself from its southern neighbor. After all, as Anthony D. Smith stresses in his book Nationalism, quote, "The panoply of national symbols only serves to express, represent, and reinforce the boundary definition of the nation, and to unite the members inside through a common imagery of shared memories, myths, and values, made all the stronger if you have to stitch it one by one." The maple leaves featured on the Chatelaine sampler echoed the central motif on the Canadian flag, the stylized 11-point maple leaf. Ironically, this iconic symbol had a controversial birthing story directly related to the crafts. In 1965, when Lester B. Pearson's government adopted the new red and white flag, it was said to be designed by Jacques Saint-Cyr, but others have claimed that it was copied from a similarly stylized 13-point red maple leaf used on the Canadian craft store Canada's Four Corners, established in 1963 and still located at 85 Spark Street in Ottawa. And you can see their red maple leaf on the very right. Although the maple leaf has served as a symbol for Canada since the 18th century, it is absent from early popular culture craft examples such as those contained in Chatelaine magazine. Today, however, if you Google Canada and crafts, you get over 500,000 flag-inspired ideas. Chatelaine, its online community boards, are filled with these examples, including this homemade flag for Canada Day by Kim Kim One, who echoes Benedict Anderson accidentally, I'm assuming, when she writes, quote, "I am not a crafty person, but it is so easy for families to make and a reminder that people make a country." The Canadian flag is center stage in one of the best publicized homespun craft stories in Canada these days, a story that highlights both how far we've come in terms of women's use of crafts for nationalistic goals, and simultaneously how little attitudes toward gender and craft have actually changed. Before I discuss this concluding example, I have to beg your permission to equate craft and cooking, as the two areas are used interchangeably in the descriptions of this hobby craft. This really is the ideal hobby craft. It's easy, it follows a preordained pattern, it uses readily accessible materials, falls into comfortable heteronormative roles for women, and it packs a patriotic punch. It is, of course, the red, white, and delicious strawberry shortcake Canada Day birthday cake. And it's a remarkably crafty cake. As you can see here, Craft Canada even features a downloadable PDF pattern and an online video for creating the perfect maple leaf out of sliced strawberries. And it is delicious, composed, of course, of Jell-O and Cool Whip, all craft products. In 1991, Elaine Fritz of Bobcaygeon, Ontario, began campaigning to make strawberry shortcake Canada's official birthday cake. The Canadian media picked this story up and emphasized three things about Elaine Fritz: her gender, her age, and her patriotism. As Maclean's magazine described it, quote, "The patriotic 65-year-old who once planted 5,000 red and white petunias in the shape of a 23 by 31 meter Canadian flag in her field has gone into overdrive in her campaign, mailing out 307 postcards with a photo of her strawberry shortcake on every one and a plea neatly typed out on the back to nearly every member of Parliament, plus one to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, asking them to declare the cake Canada's national dessert." The article employs a condescending tone throughout. From its use of Fritz's own statement, quote, "It can be as ethnic as anyone desires because almost all nationalities have their own version, but over it we are joined to each other by a creamy coating, all under the Canadian flag." To its description of her as a, quote, "former factory worker," that was really hard to read with a straight face. Described her as a, quote, "former factory worker, mini donut maker, and science enthusiast." This condescension is furthered by the response of the 4 MPs who bothered to engage with Fritz's postcard campaign. Quote, "Then MP Robert Oliphant of Don Valley West wrote that he would support the move if Fritz could convince her own MP, Barry Devlin, to present a private member's bill. Oliphant even promised to bake Devlin a shortcake, quote, if the ball gets rolling." The final laugh at the expense of Fritz comes when she recounts her conversation with an MP's assistant, quote, "And do you know what they said? We've got to be politically correct, and what about all the blueberry farmers? I mean, I just get a headache." Well, there are obvious problems declaring strawberry shortcake the national cake of Canada. Most importantly, the fact that it is seen, I believe, internationally as the quintessential American dessert. I Googled Nigella Lawson, who states, quote, "I've long been fascinated by this American pudding." The dismissal of Fritz's efforts and the easy joke her hobbycraft provided the Canadian media raises many questions. Why was it still shocking in 2011 to think of a male MP baking a strawberry shortcake? Why was Fritz's age part of the joke? Didn't grandmothers quilt and start and run the suffragette movement and knit mittens for the Red Cross? True, the do-it-yourself movement likes to pick on grandmas, most famously through Jenny Hart's sublime stitching tagline, "This ain't your grandma's embroidery," and I think we should all send her things from the conference. But they are also revered for passing along craft knowledge. Was Fritz making herself vulnerable by stepping out from behind the anonymity of being just another Canadian woman crafting away in her kitchen to taking center stage and declaring her national pride through craft? Maybe the lesson to be learned here is that while there is influence in the anonymous masses of the amateur crafters producing objects of political significance, on an individual level, it is still read as kitsch. We have a long way to go before condescending attitudes toward women's hobbycraft disappear. Until then, popular craft will continue to be a powerful but gendered tool in shaping national ideals, an under-recognized part of our country's deep horizontal comradeship. Thank you very much.